The youngling Checo was the first to hear the old planet breathe. It happened on a dead world, the star charts of the Sibholt brood called Cinder Sol 3, a blue rock long gone gray, and Checo was only there because no one else wanted the job. The brood mothers had sent the smallest children to scrape the husk worlds for metal, the way they always did, because children were cheap, and the unmaking was patient, and metal was the only thing that still mattered. Checo knelt in the dust of a drained ocean with a cutting claw too big for two small hands, and listened to a sound that had no right to exist. It was a heartbeat, slow, far below, once every 9 seconds, a deep and certain thud, as if something the size of a continent were keeping time. Checo had heard a great many sounds in 11 seasons of life. The hiss of the unmaking eating a moon, the wet click of a brood sister being unmade in front of the whole nest because she had touched gray water, the long silence of ships that went out and did not answer. The youngling had been born to those sounds, the way every Sibholt of every generation had been born to them, because for as long as the brood had any memory at all, the galaxy had been a quiet and a gray and a frightening place, and the loudest thing in it was the silence where everything else used to be. The brood did not teach its children about the galaxy that had been. There was no point. The old text spoke of a sky crowded with the lights of 1,000 peoples, of trade roads between the stars, of names and tongues and songs beyond counting, but the texts were a kind of grief the brood mothers had decided long ago not to pass to the young, because a child who knows what was lost grieves harder than a child who only knows what is. So Checo had grown up knowing the galaxy as it was, which was a graveyard with a single brood crawling through it, and had not grieved the rest, because you cannot grieve a thing you were never allowed to love. But Checo had never heard a heartbeat from inside a dead world, and so the youngling did the worst possible thing a Sibholt child could do, which was become curious instead of afraid. The cutting claw went into the gray crust. It came back with a fleck of something that was not gray. It was silver, bright, clean, mirror-bright silver, the kind of metal the brood had not seen in living memory, the kind that the unmaking could not stain. Checo turned it in the weak light of a dying sun and saw a shape pressed into it, a small raised mark that meant nothing to a Sibholt eye. 2 letters from a language no creature alive could read, a circle with a line through it, and beside it a number. The number was not important yet. The youngling did not know that, in another place and another tongue, the circle and line had once meant a planet, and the planet had once been called Earth. What Checo knew was simpler. The dead world was not dead. Something under the gray was keeping its heart beating, 9 seconds at a time, and it had been doing so for a very, very long time, waiting, the way a banked fire waits under ash for a single breath of air. The youngling should have run, should have flown back to the scrape shuttle and told no one and let the gray world keep its secret, because in the brood there was one law older than all the others, the only law that had kept any Sibholt alive across 500,000 years of the unmaking. The law was this: do not wake what sleeps. The galaxy was a graveyard now, and graveyards were full of sleepers, and the brood had survived precisely because it learned, over 100,000 generations, to step softly past the great quiet things and take only the dead metal and leave the rest alone. But Checo was 11 seasons old, and the heartbeat was beautiful, and the silver was clean, and the youngling pressed one small hand flat against the warm metal under the ash and did the thing no child of the brood had done in 500,000 years. Checo knocked. 3 taps. Soft, the way a youngling taps the shell of an egg sib to ask if anyone is home. For a long moment nothing happened, and Checo felt the cold flood of relief that comes when a foolish thing turns out to be harmless. The heartbeat went on. 9 seconds. Thud. 9 seconds. Thud. The gray wind blew. The dying sun sank toward the husk of a mountain that had once been a coastline. Then the world answered. It did not answer with violence. That was the part Checo would carry for the rest of a long life, the part the youngling would tell to grandchildren who would not believe it. It answered the way a sleeping giant answers a child's knock, slowly, gently, with a care that was somehow more frightening than any roar. The ground beneath Checo's feet warmed. The silver under the ash brightened, as if a current were rising through it. And from far below, from the place where the heartbeat lived, a sound came up through 5 kilometers of dead crust, a sound that Checo's translator could not parse, but that the youngling understood anyway. The way you understand a thing felt in the bones before it is ever known in the mind. It was a voice, old beyond counting, and it asked a single question, in a tongue dead for 500,000 years, and the question was not a threat and not a welcome. It was only a question, patient and clear, rising out of the grave of a world. The translator caught one word of it. Just one. It rendered the word, after a long stutter of confusion, as awake? And 5 kilometers down, under a planet the galaxy thought it had buried, 10,000 lanterns that had not burned since the death of a species began, one by one, to light. Checo ran. The youngling ran the way only a terrified child can run, up the scree of the dead ocean floor, scrambling on all 6 limbs, the scrape shuttle a small dark wedge against the bruised sky. Behind, the world was changing. The gray crust over a region wider than a sea was lifting, not exploding but rising, peeling back in great clean sheets, as something underneath shouldered its way toward the light it had not seen in 500,000 years. By the time Checo reached the shuttle, the heartbeat was no longer 1, it was 10,000. They came up out of the ground in silence. That was the thing the youngling could never make the elders understand later, the silence of it. A waking thing should be loud. But the lanterns of the buried fleet rose through the parting crust without a single sound a Sibholt could hear, their hulls bright as the silver fleck, their flanks scrolling over with marks no living eye could read, 10,000 shapes pulling free of the planet that had hidden them like seeds pulling free of soil. They were not new. Checo could see that even through fear. Their hulls were scarred, every one of them, scored and dented and patched, the hulls of ships that had fought a war long before the brood's first ancestor crawled out of a warm sea. But the scars were old, and the metal was clean, and the lanterns burned, and a thing that is scarred but unbroken after 500,000 years is the most frightening thing in any sky. Checo flew. The shuttle screamed up through the parting crust between 2 rising hulls, each one larger than the whole Sibholt nest city, and not one of them so much as turned a weapon toward the fleeing child. They let the youngling go. That, too, Checo would remember. They did not care about one small frightened scrape child. They had woken for something else, and the something else was older and larger, and a great deal worse than one terrified 11-season youngling clutching a fleck of silver in a shaking claw. The brood heard the news the way a still pond hears a stone. By the time Checo's shuttle limped into the nest city of Farmare, a wandering hollow rock the brood had hidden in for 9 generations, the long-range eyes had already seen it. 10,000 contacts, where there should have been a dead world. The brood mothers gathered in the deep chamber. The old ones, the ones who remembered the names of moons that no longer existed, and they did what the brood always did when something woke. They prepared to flee. It was the only strategy they had. It was the only strategy that had ever worked. For 500,000 years, the Sibholt had not won a single battle, because there was nothing to win against. The thing that had emptied the galaxy was not an enemy you could fight. The elders called it the Unmaking, and the younger ones called it the Gray, and the oldest texts the brood still carried called it by a name that translated, roughly, as the rot that learned to want. It was not a fleet. It was not a hive. It was a contaminant, a self-spreading gray corruption that ate worlds and ships and living flesh and turned every atom it touched into more of itself. More gray, more rot, more want. It had no center to strike. It had no mind to outwit. It simply spread, the way a stain spreads through cloth, patient and total and undefeatable, and every species that had ever tried to fight it was now part of it. 10 billion years of life rendered down to a uniform and hungry gray. The brood survived by running, by staying small, by hiding in hollow rocks and dead comets, scraping the husk worlds for the clean metal the gray had not yet found, never staying anywhere long enough for the rot to catch the scent. That was the whole of Sibholt civilization now, a single brood of perhaps 400,000 souls fleeing forever, ahead of a tide that never tired, and Checo had just knocked on the door of the one thing the law forbade, and woken 10,000 sleepers on a world that the Grey was, even now, 3 days from reaching. In the deep chamber, the broodmother called Old Vesh held the fleck of silver in her ancient claw and turned it over and over. She was the oldest creature in the brood. She had seen 4 nest worlds lost. She remembered the taste of real water before the brood learned to fear it. And she looked at the small mark pressed into the silver, the circle with the line through it, and something moved behind her clouded eyes that Checo had never seen there, a thing the youngling did not have a word for, because the brood had unlearned the word a long time ago. It was hope, and it terrified her more than the Grey ever had. "There is a story," Old Vesh said, and her voice was very quiet, so that the whole chamber leaned in to hear it. "Older than the brood, older than running. My nest mother told it to me, and her nest mother to her, back and back, a story we were told never to repeat, because to repeat it was to hope, and to hope was to die slower." She closed her claw around the silver. "The story says that once, a very long time ago, before the Grey ate the first star, there was a world of warm seas and loud, soft creatures who built ships. And the story says the Grey came for them too, as it comes for everyone. And the story says the loud, soft creatures did a thing no one else has ever done." The chamber was silent. Even the youngest of the brood children had gone still. "The story says they lost," said Old Vesh. "The Grey ate their world, the way it ate everyone's world. The last of them died screaming, the way everyone dies. There is no shame in it. We have all lost. We are all dying, slower or faster." Her clouded eyes found Checo across the chamber, the small youngling who had knocked. "But the story says that before they died, the loud, soft creatures did one thing. They built a fleet they would never live to use. They built it not to win a war they were already losing, but to keep a promise to a galaxy that had not yet been born. And they hid it. And they put their best minds inside the ships, so the ships would not be alone, and they set the heartbeat going, 9 seconds at a time, and they buried the whole thing under a dead world, and they left a single instruction in the deep machines." "What instruction?" Checo asked, because the youngling could not help it. Old Vesh opened her claw. The silver caught the dim light of the chamber. "Wake," she said, "when someone who is still trying to live comes and knocks on the door." The brood did not flee that day. It was the first time in 9 generations they had stayed when something woke. They stayed because Old Vesh, who had buried 4 worlds and never once chosen to hope, looked at the small youngling who had broken the oldest law and decided, in the last seasons of a very long life, that she was tired of running, and that if the story was even half true, then it was time to find out. She was old. She would die soon, of age if not the Grey, and she would rather die knowing than die running. So the brood watched the long-range eyes and waited, and 3 days later the Grey arrived at Cinder Sol 3. It came the way it always came, a slow grey wave across the dark, a smear of nothing that swallowed the light of the stars behind it. The brood had seen it 1,000 times. They knew exactly how this ended. The Grey would wash over the dead world and the 10,000 silver ships, and the silver ships would become Grey ships, and then Grey dust, and the rot would grow a little larger, the way it always did, fattened on whatever foolish thing had thought it could stand. That was not what happened. The brood watched through the long-range eyes, 400,000 souls holding a single breath, as the Grey wave reached the Silver Fleet. And the Silver Fleet did not flee and did not die. The 10,000 ships rose to meet the rot in a formation so old and so perfect that the watching broodmothers, who had forgotten what a battle even looked like, did not understand at first what they were seeing. The lead ship came forward alone, the largest of them, a hull the size of a small moon with 10,000 years of scars on its silver flanks, and across the dark it broadcast a single signal, a signal it had been holding inside its dead machines for 500,000 years, waiting for the one enemy it had been built to face. Checo's translator caught it. The whole brood's translators caught it, every device tuned to the same impossible frequency, and the words that came across the void were spoken in that dead and patient tongue, and they were not a threat, and they were not a plea, and they were, the youngling understood, a kind of greeting between two very old enemies who had been waiting a very long time to finish a fight. The lead ship said, "We remember what you did to our home. We have had 500,000 years to think about it, and we have been awake for 3 days, which is plenty." Then the Lantern of Ald, flagship of a fleet built by a species that had been extinct for 500,000 years, opened fire on the thing that killed it, and the brood of the Sibholt learned, for the first time in their entire history, what it looked like when something fought the Grey, and the Grey was the thing that should have run. The brood had no word for what they saw, because the brood had never seen a weapon used in anger. They had only ever seen the Grey, which did not use weapons, which simply touched and consumed. So when the Lantern of Ald fired, the watching elders flinched and waited for the inevitable, the moment when the rot would swallow the light and grow. The light did not get swallowed. It is hard to describe a weapon to a people who have forgotten that weapons exist. The brood mothers tried, for years afterward, and never managed it. The closest old Vesh ever came was this. She said it was as if the silver ship reached out and unmade a piece of the unmaking. The Grey, which turned all things to grey, met something that turned the grey back into nothing. A lance of clean white fire crossed the dark, and where it touched the grey wave, the rot did not spread and did not consume. It died. It simply died, a thing the brood had not known the Grey could do, a whole region of the contaminant, going dark and still, and then gone, scoured out of existence as if it had never learned to want anything at all. And then the other 9,999 ships opened fire together. The brood had a word, after all, for what came next. They had to invent it. The word they made meant, roughly, the night the dark fought back, and the brood children would sing it for 1,000 years. 10,000 lances of white fire crossed the void at once. Where they struck, the Grey came apart. The contaminant that had eaten a galaxy, the rot that had no center and no mind and no fear, met a fleet that had been built for one purpose by a species that had studied the thing for the last desperate centuries of its own life, and the fleet did not try to outnumber it, because nothing could outnumber the Grey, and the fleet did not try to outrun it, because nothing could outrun the Grey. The fleet did the one thing in all the galaxy the Grey had never once encountered. It heard it. The brood mothers, watching, finally understood the scars. The 10,000 ships were not pristine because they had never fought. They were scarred because they had fought. Long ago, before the burial, in the last war of a dying world, the species that built them had not been able to save themselves. The Grey was already in their oceans, already in their lungs, already turning their children grey, and they knew they were finished. So they did not build a fleet to win, they built a fleet to learn. Every ship was a laboratory. Every battle of that final war had been an experiment, a careful and terrible study of exactly how the unmaking spread, exactly what frequency of clean fire made the Grey die instead of grow, and they wrote down everything they learned in the deep machines of 10,000 ships, and then they died. And before they died, they aimed those ships at the future. They could not save their own world, so they built the cure for someone else's, and they put it to sleep under the grave of their home, and they set the heartbeat going, and they left the door unlocked for any creature still trying to live. Checo had knocked, and the cure had woken. The battle above Cindersol 3 lasted 9 hours, and the brood watched every minute of it, and not one of them looked away. They saw the Grey wave, which should have swallowed everything, recoil. They saw it try to flow around the fleet, the way it always flowed around obstacles, and they saw the fleet split into formations that closed the gaps faster than the rot could find them. They saw the Grey try the only trick it had ever needed, which was to simply touch a ship and begin to convert it, and they saw the silver hulls shrug the contaminant off as if it were water on oiled feathers, because the loud, soft creatures had learned, in their last years, how to build metal the Grey could not hold. The brood studied that battle for the rest of their history, played it back across the generations, and the more they studied it, the more they understood that it was not a battle at all, in the way the old texts meant the word. The strangers were not trading blows with an enemy. They were performing a procedure, a thing rehearsed and certain, the way a healer who has done the same surgery 10,000 times no longer thinks about the cuts. Every move the fleet made answered a move the Grey made before the Grey had quite finished making it, as if the silver ships were not reacting to the rot at all, but remembering it, reading from a script written long ago on a dying world by people who had watched this exact enemy do this exact thing 1,000 times and had written down every single answer. When the rot probe left, the fleet was already left. When it surged at a seam, the seam was already closed. When it tried, in the 7th hour, a thing it had perhaps never tried before, gathering a spear of itself and driving it straight at the Lantern of Ald in what the brood could only call rage, the flagship did not even break formation. It simply opened, the great hull parting along a seam the brood had not known was there, and the gray spear passed through the empty space where the ship's heart should have been and out the other side into the waiting fire of the ship behind, and the Lantern of Ald closed again, unhurt, as if it had merely stepped aside from a thrown stone. That was the thing the brood could never quite hold in their minds, in all the long retellings. The fleet was never once in danger. The brood had expected a desperate fight, a thing of losses and last stands and ships dying bravely, because every story the brood had ever told itself about courage was a story about dying well, since dying was the only thing the brood had ever been able to do. But the strangers had not built a fleet to die well. They had built a fleet to win without loss, completely, the way you solve a problem you have already solved, and across 9 hours of the largest battle the Sibholt had ever witnessed, not one silver ship was lost, not one was even truly threatened, because the entire terrible point of the strangers' 100 dying years had been to make sure that when the cure finally woke, it would not have to be brave. It would only have to be right, and it was right, in every move, for 9 hours, until the gray wave that had eaten a galaxy understood at last, in whatever passed for understanding in a mindless hungry thing, that it had finally met the one shape in all the dark that it could not eat. The brood saw the unmaking do a thing it had never done in 10 billion years. It pulled back. A gray region the size of a solar system, the leading edge of a contaminant that had eaten a galaxy without ever once retreating, gathered itself and withdrew from the Silver Fleet, and the long-range eyes of the brood recorded the moment, and the recording would be played in the deep chambers of the Sibholt for the rest of their history, because it was the moment 400,000 frightened souls learned that the thing they had fled for 500,000 years could be made to flee. Old Vesh wept. She had no word for it. The brood had unlearned weeping a long time ago, because weeping was a thing you did when you still believed crying might be answered, and the brood had not believed that in 9 generations. But the old broodmother sat in the deep chamber with the silver fleck in her claw and made a sound her own children did not recognize, and Checo understood, watching her, that some doors, once knocked upon, can never be closed again. There was a thing the brood did not yet know, and the Silver Fleet had known it from the first second of waking. The gray did not retreat clean. When the leading edge of the contaminant pulled back from the killing fire, it did not pull back all at once. It left tendrils. The rot was mindless, but it was not without cunning, the dumb cunning of a thing that has eaten 10 billion years of cleverer things and kept all the tricks, and one of its oldest tricks was the seed, a fragment of gray, small enough to drift unseen, programmed by nothing but its own hungry chemistry to attach itself to anything that moved away from the killing ground, to ride that thing home, and to begin again somewhere quieter. For 500,000 years the gray had spread across the galaxy, not in great walls but in tiny seeds, riding fleeing ships, riding panicked broods, riding the very instinct to run, and that was the deepest reason the Sibholt had never been able to stop dying. Every time they fled, some of them carried the rot in their own hulls without knowing it, and seeded their next hiding place before they even arrived. The fleet knew this. The strangers had learned it on their own dying world, watching their own evacuation ships carry the gray to the colonies they fled toward, watching the rot use their fear as transport, And so when the contaminant pulled back from Cinder Sol 3, the Lantern of Ald did not relax. It spoke a single quiet word across the fleet, and 400 of the silver ships peeled away from the main wall and spread out into the dark in a pattern the brood did not understand. A slow and patient sweep, and they began to hunt the seeds. Checo watched it on the long-range eyes and did not know what they were doing. The 400 ships moved through the empty void where the gray had been, and now and then one of them would slow and turn and fire a single short lance of white fire at a piece of dark that looked like nothing at all, and the long-range eyes would register a flash too small to mean anything, and the ship would move on. The youngling counted 40 such flashes in the first hour, then 100. Then the youngling stopped counting, because there were too many, and understood, slowly, with a cold that had nothing to do with fear, what the strangers were doing. They were finding every single seed the retreating gray had tried to scatter, every drifting fragment, every quiet little piece of hungry nothing that, left alone, would have ridden the dark to some far world and begun the whole long murder over again. The fleet was not just winning the battle, it was cleaning up after it, with a patience and a thoroughness the brood had never imagined a thing could have, because the strangers had learned, the hardest way anything is ever learned, that a war against the rot is not won in the loud part. It is won in the quiet part, in the long, careful sweep, in the killing of the last small seed that everyone else would have been too tired or too triumphant to look for. It took the 400 ships 9 days to be sure. 9 days of sweeping the dark around Cinder Sol 3, methodical as a mind that does not get tired and does not get bored, until the Lantern of Ald broadcast another quiet word and the 400 ships came home, and the brood understood that the strangers had just done a thing no living species had ever managed, which was to fight the gray and leave behind not a single seed of it, not one fragment, not one drifting piece of want. They had killed a battle so completely that the battle could not become 100 new battles somewhere else. And Checo, watching the 400 silver ships fold back into formation, understood that this was the real difference between the strangers and everyone who had died before them. Everyone else had fought the rot and lost. The strangers fought the rot and then, with terrible care, made sure it stayed dead. The fleet did not pursue. That surprised the brood. When the gray withdrew, the silver ships did not chase it across the dark to finish it, and the brood mothers, who were learning the rules of a thing called war, very quickly, did not understand why. It was the lead ship, the Lantern of Ald, that explained, and it explained because it chose to speak to the brood directly, on the same impossible frequency, in words their translators stuttered to keep up with. "You are watching," the Lantern said. "We felt you watching. A small ship, a frightened ship, hiding in a hollow rock, the same kind of small frightened ship that knocked on our door 3 days ago. The whole brood went still. The fleet knew they were there. We do not chase the rot," the Lantern said, and the brood would argue for centuries about whether a ship could feel things and what those feelings were. We do not chase it because chasing it is how you lose. It is everywhere. It is patient. It has had 10 billion years, and we have had 500,000. If we scattered to hunt it, we would be exactly what every dead species before us became, a brave thing spread too thin, swallowed one piece at a time. The ones who built us understood this. They wrote it on our hearts. You do not beat a tide by running into the sea. You build a wall and you make the tide break on it, and you stand on the wall and you do not move. Checo, in the deep chamber, asked the question the whole brood was thinking, and somehow the youngling's small voice carried, because the translator caught it and threw it across the void. "Then what was the point?" Checo said. "If you can't kill all of it, if it just goes around, what was the point of waking up at all?" There was a pause, 9 seconds, the length of a heartbeat. "The point," said the Lantern of Ald, "is that for 500,000 years, every creature in this galaxy believed the rot could not be hurt. They built their whole lives around that belief. They learned to run and call it living, and belief is the rot's real weapon, youngling, not the gray. The gray is just chemistry. The weapon is the belief that nothing can be done. We were not built to kill all the rot. We were built to kill that belief, and we just did. The brood heard those words, 400,000 of them, and something changed in the deep chamber that had not changed in 9 generations. It was small. It was almost nothing, but Checo felt it move through the brood like a current through silver, and the youngling would spend a lifetime trying to name it, and the closest the brood ever came was a word that meant the moment you stop measuring how long you have left and start measuring what you might do with it. Old Vesh rose. She was very old and the rising cost her, but she rose, and she lifted the silver fleck so the whole chamber could see it, the circle with the line through it, the mark of a world that had been called Earth. "We have run for 500,000 years, she said. My nest mother ran. Her nest mother ran. I have buried 4 worlds, and I have never once stood still, because standing still was death." Her clouded eyes went to the long-range eyes, to the 10,000 silver ships hanging in the dark where the gray had been. But the loud, soft creatures stood still. They lost everything, and they still stood still, and they left us a wall to stand on, and they waited 500,000 years for a frightened child to knock. She closed her claw. "I am too old to run anymore. I would like, before I die, to learn how to stand." And the Lantern of Ald, hearing this across the void, did a thing that no broodmother and no youngling had expected, a thing that would change the Sibholt forever, and a thing that the dead loud soft creatures had, it turned out, prepared for from the very beginning. It opened its hangars, and it sent the brood an invitation. The invitation was simple. "Come aboard. Bring your children. We have room." The brood mothers argued about it for 2 days, which for the Sibholt was a kind of miracle, because for 9 generations there had been nothing to argue about. The only decisions a fleeing brood ever made were which way to run and how fast. Now there was a choice that was not about running, and the brood discovered that they had nearly forgotten how to make one. The cautious ones, and there were many, said it was a trap. They said nothing wakes after 500,000 years and wants to help you. They said the silver ships would take the brood aboard, and the brood would never be heard from again, and the gray would not even have to bother. The loudest of the cautious ones was a brood father called Wren, who had lost a whole nest branch to a sleeper once, a great quiet derelict that a foolish scout had roused, and who had carried the grief of it for 40 seasons, and turned the grief, the way grief sometimes turns, into a hard and certain rule. Wren stood in the deep chamber and said what the rule had taught him, which was that the galaxy was full of dead and dangerous things, and that the only safety was distance, and that a brood which had survived 500,000 years by never trusting had no business beginning now, at the urging of a child who had broken the oldest law and a broodmother who was old enough to be careless with the time she had left. He was not cruel. He was afraid, and his fear had reasons, real ones, the bones of a lost nest branch. The brood listened to him, because the brood had survived by listening to exactly that kind of fear. But old Vesh listened too, and when Wren was done, she did not argue with his fear, because you cannot argue a people out of a fear that has kept them alive for 500,000 years. Instead, she asked him a question. She asked him whether, in all the long history of the brood, in all the nest branches lost and all the worlds buried, the fear had ever once done anything but slow the dying. She asked him to name a single time that running had saved the brood, rather than simply postponing its end by another generation. And Wren could not, because there was no such time, because the truth the brood had never let itself say aloud was that running was not surviving. Running was only dying slowly, and the brood had been dying slowly for 500,000 years, branch by branch, world by world, and the only thing the fear had ever truly purchased was the right to be afraid a little longer. "Your rule is a good rule," old Vesh told Wren, gently, in front of the whole chamber. "It has kept us alive. I do not ask you to throw it away. I only ask you to see that a rule which keeps you alive and a rule which lets you live are not always the same rule, and that we have spent so long obeying the first that we have forgotten the second even exists." She held up the silver fleck. The strangers had a rule too. Their rule said, when you cannot save yourself, save someone else. That rule did not keep them alive. It killed them, in the end, a little faster, because they spent their last 100 years building a door instead of building a wall to hide behind. And yet here we are, 400,000 of us, alive because of their rule and not ours. Tell me, Ren, whose rule would you rather your grandchildren inherit? The one that kept us alive and afraid, or the one that got the strangers killed and saved us anyway? Ren had no answer for that. No one did. And though the cautious ones did not stop being cautious, the chamber turned, slowly, the way a great heavy thing turns, toward the thing it had not allowed itself to want. It was Checo who answered them, and the youngling did not mean to. Checo was 11 seasons old and had no standing in the deep chamber, and should not have spoken at all. But when the cautious ones said that nothing helps for free, the youngling thought of the silence with which the rising fleet had let one small frightened shuttle flee, the way 10,000 ships larger than worlds had not spared a single weapon for a child, and Checo said, into the arguing dark, "They already let me go." The chamber quieted. When they woke up, the youngling said, "They could have stopped me. I was right there. One little shuttle between two ships the size of the nest, and they let me fly home. If they wanted us, they would have taken me. They didn't want me. They wanted the gray." Checo held up the silver fleck, the small hand steadier now than they had been on the dead world. A thing that wanted to hurt us would have started with the easy hurt. The easy hurt was me. They didn't take it. An old Vesh, who was dying and knew it, looked at the youngling who had broken the oldest law and said quietly, "The child is right. We did not survive 500,000 years by being fools, but we will not survive the next 500 by being only afraid. We go aboard." They went aboard. It was not a simple thing, the going. 400,000 souls do not cross the dark in an hour, and the brood was not a navy with neat ranks but a scattered, frightened, deeply cautious people who had survived precisely by never putting all of themselves in one place. Old Vesh knew this, and so she did not order the brood aboard all at once. She sent the willing first, the young and the curious and the few brave old ones, a few thousand souls in the first crossing, and she let them live aboard the silver ships for a hand of days, while the rest of the brood watched through the long-range eyes to see whether the first few thousand would scream, or vanish, or come back changed in some terrible way. They did none of those things. They came back to the long-range eyes laughing, some of them, a sound the watching brood had nearly forgotten, and they spoke of warm corridors, and clean water, and gentle voices in the air, and slowly, crossing by crossing, the brood that had survived by never trusting anything learned to trust this one impossible thing. And the Silver Fleet was patient with them. That was the part that finally undid the brood's caution, more than any words. A trap would have hurried. A thing that meant harm would have wanted the brood aboard fast, all at once, before they could think better of it. But the fleet did not hurry. It let the brood come at the brood's own pace, a few thousand at a time, over a span of days that stretched into a hand of hands of days, never once pressing, never once asking for more trust than the brood was ready to give, and a people who have been hunted for 500,000 years know, in the deepest part of the body, the difference between a thing that wants them and a thing that is simply willing to wait for them. The fleet was willing to wait. The fleet had waited 500,000 years already. A few more weeks for a frightened brood to find its courage was nothing at all to a thing that had kept a promise across the death of a species. The brood took its scrape shuttles, its hollow rock nest, its 400,000 frightened souls, and they crossed the dark to the Silver Fleet, and Checo's shuttle was among the very first to land, because the youngling had asked, and old Vesh had allowed it, and so it was an 11-seasoned scrape child who was among the first living creatures to walk inside a human ship in 500,000 years. The inside of the Lantern of Ald was not what Checo expected. The youngling had imagined cold machines, dead corridors, the bones of the loud, soft creatures lying where they had fallen. But the ship was warm, and the corridors glowed with the same clean silver light as the hull, and there were no bones, because the loud, soft creatures had not died aboard. They had died on their world. The ships had been sent out empty of the living, carrying only the minds. The first thing Checo noticed, after the warmth and the light, was the water. There was water aboard the Lantern of Ald, open water, in wide, clean basins along the corridors, and it was not gray. The youngling stood before the first basin for a long time and did not dare touch it, because for the whole of Checo's life, water had been the thing that killed you, the thing the brood sister had touched before the wet click, the carrier of the rot, the reason the brood drank only from sealed and tested stores and feared the open ocean of any world. But the water in the basin was clean, clean in a way the youngling had no memory of, and a gentle voice in the air told Checo it was safe, and after a long while the youngling reached out one small claw and touched it, and it was only water, cool and harmless and good, and Checo began to cry. The first of the brood to weep aboard the silver ships, but not the last, because the strangers had not only made a clean fleet, but had filled it with the small, clean, ordinary things the brood had forgotten a life could hold. The brood explored the Lantern of Ald for days, and never came to the end of it. It was larger inside than the whole nest city of Farmare, and every part of it was warm, and every part of it was clean, and there were chambers the brood did not understand, and gardens the brood had no word for, green growing things kept alive across 500,000 years by patient machines, and quiet halls where the gentle ghosts kept the records of a dead world, its songs and its names and its long-lost blue sky. The brood children ran through the silver corridors and laughed, and the old ones followed slowly behind them, and did not stop them, because for the first time in 9 generations, there was nothing in the world a child could run into that would harm it, and a people who have spent 500,000 years teaching their children to be afraid of everything wept to watch their young, for a few days, be afraid of nothing at all. The mines. Checo learned about the mines slowly, over the first long days aboard, and the learning of it changed the youngling forever. The loud, soft creatures, the humans, had known they would not live to crew their own fleet, so they had done a thing the brood had no concept of, a thing the dead species had spent the last of their dying genius on. They had taken the best of themselves, the minds of their finest builders and fighters and keepers, the patient ones and the clever ones and the kind ones, and they had written those minds into the deep machines of the ships, so that the fleet would not wake up empty, so that there would be someone home when the door was finally knocked upon. The Lantern of Ald was crewed by ghosts, gentle ones, the recorded minds of humans 500,000 years dead, who had agreed, in the last terrible years of their world, to give up their deaths so that some future stranger might not have to face the gray alone. Checo met one of them on the 3rd day. The youngling was small and curious, and had wandered, the way younglings do, into a chamber deeper than the brood had been shown, and there a voice spoke, an old voice, a tired and warm voice, and it said, in the dead tongue, the ship's machines now patiently taught the brood children, "You're the one who knocked." Checo froze. There was no body, just the voice, and a soft light in the air. "Don't be afraid," the voice said. "I built part of this ship, the part that listens for knocking. I spent the last 4 years of my life on it. 4 years, while everything I loved turned gray around me, building a door that might never be opened, for a stranger who might never come. A sound that might have been a laugh, very soft. And you came, after 500,000 years, a little frightened scrape child with a cutting claw. I would have liked to see your face." "Why?" Checo asked. It was the youngling's favorite question, and the only one that ever mattered. "Why build a door for strangers? You were dying. Why not save yourselves?" The voice was quiet for a long moment. 9 seconds, the length of a heartbeat. "Because we couldn't save ourselves," it said, finally. We tried everything. By the time we understood the gray, it was already in us. It was already in the water, and the air, and the children. We lost everything. The light in the air seemed to dim and then steady. But losing everything teaches you one thing, youngling. It teaches you what's worth saving. And we decided, at the very end, with nothing left to lose, that the thing worth saving was the chance. The chance that someday, somewhere, something else would still be trying to live. We couldn't save ourselves, so we built a way to save you. It seemed like the only thing a dying people could leave behind that was worth leaving." The voice had a name. It told Checo on the fourth day, when the youngling came back to the deep chamber, as the youngling came back every day after that, because a child who has found a wise and patient grown-up in a frightening place will always come back. The name was Harlan Dray, and in life he had been a builder of listening machines, and at the end he had been the man who designed the part of the fleet that waited for a knock. He told Checo about his world, the way an old keeper tells a youngling about a place that no longer exists, gently, leaving out the worst of it, but not all of the worst, because Harlan Dray did not believe in lying to children about the size of the dark. He told the youngling about the warm seas, about a sky that had been blue, a color the Sibholt had a word for only because they had seen it in the old texts. He told Checo that there had been 9 billion of his kind, once, and that they had argued and loved and built foolish and beautiful things, and that they had been, on the whole, not so different from a brood of frightened souls hiding in a hollow rock, only louder and softer and with fewer legs. And he told the youngling how the gray had come, not as a wall but as a rumor, a gray patch on a far moon that the scientists said was nothing, and then a gray patch that grew, and then the long, slow horror of watching a thing that could not be reasoned with, and could not be bargained with, and could not, it seemed, be stopped, eat its way inward across 100 years, world by world, ocean by ocean, child by child, until the only argument left among 9 billion people was not whether they would die, but what, if anything, they could leave behind, that the dying would not erase. We had 100 years, Harlan Dray told the youngling. That was the gift, if you can call it a gift. The gray is patient. It does not rush. It gave us 100 years to watch it come and to decide what to do with the time. Some of us spent it screaming. Some of us spent it pretending. And some of us, the ones who built this fleet, spent it on a single question. The light in the air steadied, the way it did when the old voice was choosing words with care. The question was this: if we cannot save ourselves, and we could not, then what is the most that a dying people can do? And we decided the most we could do was make sure we were not the last. We decided that if the rot was going to take everything that was ours, then we would spend our last 100 years building something that was not ours, something for a stranger, something the rot could not eat because it would be hidden where the rot would never think to look, under the grave of the world it had already killed. The rot never goes back to a world it has finished. Why would it? There is nothing left to want. So we hid the cure in the one place in the galaxy the gray would never return, which was the corpse of our own home. Checo sat very still in the warm silver chamber. That is a sad place to put a gift, the youngling whispered. It is, Harlan Dray agreed. It is the saddest place there is, but it was the safest, and we did not have the luxury of choosing the gift to be beautiful. We only had the luxury of choosing it to work. A pause, 9 seconds long, the heartbeat of the ship. And it worked, youngling. After 500,000 years, with everyone who built it long dead, it worked. You knocked. That is the only beautiful part, and it is enough. That is more than I dared hope for, in the last year, when I was the last of my crew still working, and the gray was coming up through the floor of the workshop, and I sealed the final door not knowing if any of it would ever matter. It mattered. You are sitting here. It mattered. Checo did not understand all of it. The youngling was 11 seasons old, but something in the warm, tired voice reached down past understanding and took hold of something in the brood child that would never let go, and Checo whispered, in the small voice of a child who has just learned the largest thing they will ever learn, "You were strangers too. To us. We never even knew you existed." "That's right," the voice said gently. "We were strangers, and we loved you anyway. That's the whole secret, youngling. That's everything we knew that the gray never figured out. The rot wants and wants and wants, and can only ever turn things into more of itself. It can eat a galaxy, and it will still be hungry, because all it can ever make is more rot. But a thing that gives, a thing that builds a door for a stranger it will never meet, that thing makes more than itself. That thing makes a future." A pause. "Go tell your brood mother we're glad they came. Tell her the wall is hers now too. Tell her she doesn't have to run anymore." Checo ran, but it was a different running now. The youngling ran to find old Vesh, and found her in the great forward chamber of the Lantern of Ald, where the broodmother sat looking out through a wide silver port, at the dark where the grey had been driven back, and the youngling told her everything: the voice, the mines, the door built for strangers, the wall that was hers now too. Old Vesh listened to all of it, and when Checo was done, the old broodmother was quiet for a long while, and then she said something the youngling would carry to the end of a very long life. 500,000 years, old Vesh said, we believed we were alone. We believed the galaxy was a graveyard, and we were the last things crawling through it, and that the only wisdom was to crawl quietly and not be noticed. She turned her clouded eyes on the youngling. We were wrong. We were never alone. They were here the whole time, asleep under a dead world, waiting. The galaxy was not a graveyard, child. It was a garden someone planted before they died, and we have been walking through it for 500,000 years, too frightened to look down and see what was growing. She reached out and closed her old claw gently over Checo's small one, over the silver fleck the youngling still carried. You looked down. You knocked. You woke the garden. Her voice cracked, just slightly. Whatever happens now, child, remember that. You did not wake a weapon. You woke a promise. But before the gray came back as a wall, it came back as a whisper, and the whisper very nearly did what the wall could not. It came aboard with the brood. That was the thing none of them had thought to fear, because the Sibholt had no concept of a thing that could ride inside you. When the 400,000 crossed the dark to the Silver Fleet, they came in their old scrape shuttles and their hollow rock nest, the patched and battered ships that had carried the brood for 9 generations. And one of those ships, an old water hauler called the Mare's Daughter, had years before brushed too close to a gray husk world while running, and had carried a single seed in a seam of its hull ever since, dormant, waiting, the way the rot always waited. The seed had ridden the brood's fear for 11 years. Now it rode the brood into the heart of the one fleet in the galaxy that could end it, and there, surrounded by the clean silver metal it could not hold and the white fire it could not survive, the seed did the only thing left to it. It woke, and it began to grow. It started in the Mare's Daughter, parked in the great hangar of a silver ship called the Quiet Warden, third in the fleet, behind the Lantern of Ald. A broodkeeper named Olm went to check the water tanks of the old hauler and found a patch of gray on the inside of the hull, no larger than a hand, soft and spreading, and Olm knew what it was the way every Sibholt knew what it was, in the deepest and oldest part of the body, and Olm did the thing the brood had done for 500,000 years. Olm screamed the alarm, and the brood prepared to run. Except there was nowhere to run. They were inside the fleet now. They had given up running. 400,000 souls in the silver corridors heard the old alarm, the flee the gray alarm, the sound that had ruled their whole history, and for one terrible moment the brood teetered on the edge of becoming again the frightened thing it had always been, a panicked stampede toward shuttles, toward the dark, toward the only safety they had ever known, which was scattering. And if they had scattered, they would have carried the seed with them into the dark, and the stranger's whole gift would have ended exactly the way every other hope had ever ended, in a brood fleeing and seeding its own doom. The Lantern of Ald spoke before the panic could finish forming. Its voice came into every corridor of every ship at once, and it was not loud, and it was not afraid, and it said the one thing the brood needed to hear and could not have told itself. "Be still," said the fleet. "Do not run. Running is how it wins. We have seen this exact thing 10,000 times. We know precisely what to do, and it does not require a single one of you to be brave. It only requires you to stand still for 90 seconds and trust a stranger. Can you do that? Stand still. We have you." And the brood, 400,000 souls who had never in 9 generations stood still while the gray grew, stood still. It was the hardest thing they had ever done. Checo, in a corridor of the Lantern of Ald, felt the whole brood shaking around the youngling, felt the ancient instinct clawing at every body to run. Run, the gray is aboard. Run, and the youngling watched the brood mothers. The old ones who had buried worlds close their eyes and hold their children and stand, because a stranger had asked them to, because the stranger had earned 90 seconds of trust, because they were so tired of running that even the terror of standing was, in some exhausted corner of the brood soul, a relief. On the quiet warden, the strangers went to work, and the brood learned what the fleet did when the rot came aboard. It was not violent. It was, again, that gentle and total care that frightened Checo more than any roar. The quiet warden sealed the hangar that held the mayor's daughter, sealed it in clean silver that the gray could not eat, and then it did not burn the old hauler, because burning would have scattered the seed into smoke, and the smoke might have carried it. Instead, the strangers reached into the hangar with something the brood had no name for, a field of the same clean white that the fleet fired at the rot, but slow now, careful, surgical, and they found the seed where it grew, the hand-sized patch and the seam it had ridden in on, and every microscopic tendril it had begun to send into the old hull, and they unmade all of it, the way a healer cuts out a sickness, taking the rot and a margin of clean metal around it to be sure, leaving the rest of the mayor's daughter whole. 90 seconds. The brood stood still for 90 seconds, and at the end of it the quiet warden opened the hangar and the gray was gone, every fleck of it, and the old water hauler sat clean and whole and dripping with the cold of the field, and the seed that had ridden the brood's fear for 11 years was simply, finally, not there anymore. The broodkeeper Olm, who had screamed the alarm, walked back into the hangar and put a claw against the clean hull of the mayor's daughter, and could not speak. For Olm's entire life, and for the entire life of the brood, the appearance of gray on a hull had meant one thing and one thing only, which was that the hull, and everyone on it, was already lost. There was no treatment, there was no cure. There was only the flight from the doomed thing, the abandonment, the long grief. And here was a hull that had shown gray and was now clean, a thing that had never once happened in 500,000 years, and Olm understood, standing there, that the strangers had not only built a wall against the great tides of the rot. They had built, in their last desperate 100 years, the one thing the brood had wanted more than anything, and never dared even to imagine. They had built a way to take the gray out of a thing and let the thing live. The lantern of Ald spoke once more, into the quiet that followed. "This is why we do not let you run," it said gently, "not because running is cowardly. There is no cowardice in fear of the rot. We feared it too, with everything we had. We do not let you run because running spreads it, and standing still lets us cure it. That is the whole secret your people never had the chance to learn, because no one ever gave you 90 safe seconds to learn it in. We are giving you the 90 seconds. We will give you as many as you need, for as long as it takes, until standing still while we work is no longer the bravest thing your children can imagine, but simply the thing they do, the ordinary thing, the thing that is so safe it is boring. That is the future we are building. A galaxy where the gray on a hull is a small problem a keeper handles before lunch. We will not live to see it, neither will you. But your grandchildren's grandchildren will find it boring, and that, youngling, is the most beautiful thing a dying people ever dared to want. Checo would remember that too. The day the brood stood still, the day the gray came off a hull and the hull lived. The youngling did not know it yet, but it was the day the Sibholt stopped being a people who ran and started being a people who stood, and every standing thing the brood would ever build, across all the long centuries to come, began in that corridor, in those 90 seconds, in the moment 400,000 frightened souls trusted a stranger and were not betrayed. And outside the silver port, far across the dark, the gray began to gather itself for a second time, because the rot did not learn, and did not despair, and did not stop. It had been hurt. It did not understand being hurt. But it knew only one answer to everything, which was to come back larger, and so it came, a gray tide vaster than the first, pulling itself together from 1,000 husk worlds, swelling toward the silver fleet to do the only thing it had ever known how to do. The lantern of Ald saw it coming. The whole fleet saw it coming. And the warm, tired voice of a human 500,000 years dead spoke once more, across every translator in the brood, calm and certain and almost, the youngling thought, glad. "We've been waiting for this," it said. Take your children to the inner chambers, hold them close, and watch, if you can bear to. Watch what your strangers built. Watch what a promise looks like when it finally gets to be kept. The second tide was the largest thing the Grey had ever made. The brood watched it come from the inner chambers of the silver ships. 400,000 souls pressed close. The youngest ones held tight, and even the bravest among them shook. The first Grey wave had been the size of a solar system. This one was the size of 10. The rot had gathered itself from 100 dead worlds and 1,000 drained stars, drawing in every scrap of Grey across half the dark, becoming for the first time in 10 billion years, not a tide, but a wall of hungry nothing, reaching from one edge of the visible void to the other, rolling toward 10,000 silver ships, and one terrified brood with the slow and total certainty of a thing that had never once been stopped for long. Checo held a smaller youngling, an egg sib barely out of the shell, and watched the Grey wall swallow the stars, and was afraid in a way the youngling had never been afraid. Because this was not a battle. This was the end coming to collect a debt 500,000 years overdue. The youngling looked for old Vesh, and found her standing at the silver port, not hiding, not held, the oldest creature in the brood facing the largest thing the rot had ever built. And the youngling understood that the brood mother had decided to die standing, the way the strangers had, and the understanding made Checo stand too, small and shaking, the egg sib clutched close, in the deepest of the inner chambers of the Lantern of Ald. The fleet did not move. That was the thing. The Grey wall came, and the silver fleet held its formation and did not flinch, 10,000 scarred ships in a line across the dark, and the brood thought, this is where the bravest thing they ever saw becomes the saddest thing they ever saw. This is where the wall breaks the wall. And then the Lantern of Ald spoke for the last time, on every frequency the brood could hear, and its voice was not afraid, and it said, "You think you are large. You have eaten a galaxy, and you think that makes you the biggest thing in the dark. But we measured you, long ago, on a world you killed. We learned exactly how large you can grow, and exactly how fast, and exactly what it costs you to grow that large. And do you know what we learned, in the last years of our lives, watching you eat our children? We learned that the bigger you get, the more of you there is to die at once." And then the fleet did not fire one ship at a time. It fired as one. The brood had no word for it, and never found one. 10,000 ships, every weapon they carried, every lance of clean white fire, released in a single instant across the whole front of the Grey wall, not aimed at the edge of the rot, but aimed deep, into the heart of it, into the place where the Grey had gathered the most of itself, where it had pulled in everything it had to make the biggest thing it could. The strangers had waited for exactly this. They had built a wall, and they had let the tide gather itself into one place, into one enormous and overconfident mass, because a tide spread thin across a galaxy could not be killed, but a tide gathered into a single wall to crush one fleet was for one moment all in one place, and a thing all in one place can be struck all at once. The Grey wall lit up from the inside. The brood watched, and the light of it filled the inner chambers, white and clean and total, and the rot that had eaten 10 billion years of life came apart from the center outward, the clean fire racing through the gathered mass, faster than the Grey could spread, killing the Grey where it was thickest, where there was the most of it to kill. And then the Grey did the one thing the strangers had not been certain it would do, the thing they had spent their last desperate years preparing for and praying they would never have to face. It split. A wall dying from the center cannot stay a wall, so the rot, in the only intelligent act it had ever performed in 10 billion years, an intelligence that was not thought but pure cornered instinct, abandoned the wall. It tore itself into 1,000,000 pieces in a single instant, scattering in every direction at once, each fragment racing away from the killing fire toward the open dark, toward escape, toward the long, thin, scattered survival that had always been its true nature. If even 1/100th of those fragments reached open space, the Grey would survive, and seed, and the whole battle would mean nothing, and the galaxy would still die, only slower. The rot had eaten 10 billion years of cleverer things by knowing exactly when to stop being a wall and start being a million seeds, and it knew it now, and it ran. It ran into the thing the strangers had built the entire fleet to be. Because the silver ships had never been a line. The brood had thought it was a line, 10,000 ships standing shoulder to shoulder against the tide, but the strangers had not built a line. They had built a net. The formation that looked, from the inner chambers, like a wall facing a wall, was in truth a vast and patient mesh spread across the whole front of the dark, and the gaps in it were not weaknesses but doors, and the doors led nowhere, because behind the first net was a second net, and behind that a third, 9,000 and more ships layered back into the dark, in a depth the brood had never imagined, every one of them waiting for exactly this, for the moment the cornered rot would stop being one big thing and become a million small ones and try to run. The fleet harvested the fragments. There was no other word for it, though the brood looked for a kinder one for years. The million scattering pieces of the gray raced for the open dark and found the second net, and the white fire took them, not in one great blast now but in a million small precise strikes, each silver ship picking the fragments that came toward it, the way a thing with infinite patience picks ripe fruit, never hurried, never missing, the cure that the strangers had spent 100 years learning, applied now not to a wall, but to every individual seed of the wall. 10,000 ships firing not as one, but as 10,000, each making its own 1,000 small perfect judgments, faster than any living mind could follow. The fragments that slipped the second net found the third. The few that slipped the third found the 400 sweeper ships the brood had watched clean the dark after the first battle, already in position, already waiting, because the strangers had known the rot would try to scatter, and had placed the cleanup before the battle even began. Not one fragment reached open space, not one. The brood watched the long-range eyes and counted, the way Checo had counted the seeds after the first battle, and lost count again, and understood again, with that cold that was not fear, that the strangers were not just winning. They were making certain, with a thoroughness that was almost unbearable to watch, that there would be nothing left to lose to. The gray had survived 10 billion years by scattering. The strangers had built a fleet whose entire deep design, whose every layered net and patient sweeper, existed for the single purpose of making sure that the one time the rot tried to scatter and live, it scattered into a thing that had been waiting 500,000 years to catch every last piece of it. The chain of unmaking ran through the unmaking itself, the cure burning through the contagion, at the speed of the very chemistry the strangers had spent their dying years to learn, and it ran through the wall, and it ran through the million fragments, and it ran through the seeds of the fragments, until there was nothing of the great second tide left to burn. It took 9 seconds, the length of a heartbeat. The brood would always remember that it took 9 seconds, because the silver ships counted it out for them, one slow, certain pulse, the same heartbeat Checo had heard under a dead world, and when the 9th second ended, the gray wall was gone, not driven back, not wounded, gone. The largest thing the rot had ever built, 10 solar systems of gathered contaminant, the desperate overreach of a thing that knew only how to come back bigger, burned out of the dark and into nothing, and where it had been, there was only the clean black void and the returning light of stars that had not been seen in 500,000 years. The brood did not cheer. They did not know how. Instead, 400,000 souls made a sound the Sibholt had never made before, a low and rising sound that had no word, the sound of a people learning, all at once, that the thing they had feared their entire history was not infinite after all, that it could gather, and it could swell, and it could become the biggest thing in the dark, and it could still, when it grew greedy enough to gather in one place, be killed. Not all of it. The strangers had been honest about that. There was still gray out there, scattered thin across the husk worlds, still patient, still hungry. The fleet had not ended the gray, but it had done the thing no creature had done in 10 billion years. It had taught the rot to be afraid of gathering. It had taught the unmaking that to come back bigger was to die bigger, and the rot, mindless as it was, would carry that lesson in its chemistry now, would never again pull itself into one great wall, would stay scattered and thin and small, and a thing that must stay scattered and thin and small is a thing that can, at last, be hunted down across the long centuries, one husk world at a time, by a fleet that does not tire and a brood that has finally stopped running. Old Vesh did not live to see the hunting. She died 11 days later, in the warm silver heart of the Lantern of Ald, very old and very tired, and for the first time in 9 generations of brood mothers, unafraid. Checo was with her at the end. The youngling had not left her side, and in her last hours, the old brood mother held the silver fleck in her ancient claw, the circle with the line through it, the mark of a world called Earth, and she pressed it into Checo's small hands and closed the youngling's claws around it. "You knocked," she said, her voice almost gone. "When everyone else in 500,000 years was too afraid, you knocked. Remember that, when you are old and they ask you why we stopped running. Tell them a child was curious. Tell them curiosity was the bravest thing left in the galaxy, and a youngling had it when the rest of us had forgotten how." Her clouded eyes found the warm light in the air, the gentle ghost of a stranger, 500,000 years dead. "And tell them," she whispered, "that we were never alone. Tell them somebody loved us before we were born, and built us a door, and waited. Tell them that, child. Tell them forever." She died with the silver fleck warm between her claws and the youngling's hands around hers, and the gentle ghosts of the Lantern of Ald dimmed their lights in a way the brood understood to be respect, the way one keeper honors another, across the gulf of 2 extinct ways of being, across 500,000 years of the dark. The brood did not know how to mourn her. They had buried 4 worlds and 10,000 of their own across the generations, but they had always buried them running, in haste, with the gray at their backs and no time to grieve, and so the brood had never learned the slow shape of a true mourning, the kind you make when there is finally time. It was the gentle ghosts who taught them. Harlan Dray spoke to the whole brood, in the dead tongue the children now half understood, and told them how his own people had honored their dead, not with flight but with stillness, with the speaking of names and the telling of deeds, with the gathering of the living to say, "Here is who this one was, and here is what they did, and here is why we will not forget them." And so the brood gathered, all 400,000 of them, in the great chambers of the Silver Fleet, and they spoke the name of Old Vesh, the brood mother who had buried 4 worlds and chosen, at the very end of a very long life, to stop running and learn to stand. They spoke of the days she did not flee. They spoke of the question she asked Ren, the question that turned a frightened people toward the thing they had not let themselves want. And the speaking of her took a whole day, and at the end of it the brood understood that this, too, was a thing the strangers had given them, not only a clean fleet and a green future, but the time, at last, to grieve their dead the way the dead deserved, which is to say slowly and fully and without fear. Checo kept the silver fleck. The youngling wore it from that day forward, on a cord around the small neck, and would wear it for the whole of a long life, the circle with the line through it, the mark of Earth, and the brood came to understand it as a thing of office, the sign of the one who carries the memory of the knock. There would be other keepers after Checo, and each would carry the fleck, and each would carry the story, and the fleck would pass down the long generations of a brood that no longer ran, worn smoother and smoother by countless careful claws, until the mark of the dead world was almost gone from it, polished nearly to silver again by the holding of a people the dead world had saved. Checo grew up aboard the Silver Fleet. The youngling who had knocked became, in time, the first of a new kind of Sibholt, a brood that did not flee. They learned the dead tongue of the strangers from the gentle ghosts, and they learned to crew the silver ships alongside them, the living and the long dead working the same warm corridors. And the brood that had numbered 400,000 frightened souls hiding in a hollow rock became, over the generations, a fleet people, a wall people, a brood that hunted the scattered gray across the husk worlds and burned it thin and burned it small and took back, one dead world at a time, the garden that someone had planted before they died. Checo was there for the first world. The youngling was grown by then, no longer 11 seasons but 30, a keeper in training aboard the Lantern of Ald, when the fleet came to a husk world the old charts called Tabran's Reach, a gray rock that had been a green world once, drowned in the rot for 200,000 years. The brood had passed it 100 times across the generations and never once slowed, because a gray world was a dead world, and a dead world was nothing but a place to fear. But the fleet did not pass it. The fleet stopped. And then the silver ships did the thing they had been built to do, not to a tide, and not to a wall, but to a whole world, patient and slow and total, sweeping the gray from the husk of Tabran's Reach, the way the quiet warden had swept it from a single hull. An ocean of clean white fire poured across 200,000 years of rot, layer by layer, season by season, for the work of cleaning a world is not the work of an afternoon. It took 11 years. The fleet held station over Tabran's Reach for 11 years, and the brood lived in orbit and watched, and at the end of the 11 years the gray was gone, scoured down to the bare clean bone of a planet that had not been clean in 200,000 years, and the strangers reached into the deep machines they had carried for 500,000 years, and brought out the last gift they had hidden there. The gift the brood had not known was waiting. Seeds. Real ones. The strangers had carried, in the cold hearts of 10,000 ships, the patient frozen sleep of 100,000 living things from a green world long dead, grasses and trees and small soft crawling things. The memory of a biosphere, folded down and kept against exactly this day, against the impossible chance that someday a world might be made clean enough to wake them in. And the fleet seeded Tabran's Reach with the children of a world that had died before the Sibholt learned to fear water, and Checo, grown now, stood on the bridge of the Lantern of Ald and watched the first green, spread across a gray world, like a held breath finally let go. The strangers had not only built a cure, they had built a beginning. They had known, in their dying 100 years, that killing the rot was not enough, that a clean dead world was still a dead world, and so they had packed their ships, not only with the chemistry to unmake the gray, but with the living memory to replace it, so that the future they were building for strangers would not be a future of clean gray rock, but a future of green. Checo wept on the bridge, the way old Vesh had wept, with the same word the brood had had to invent, and understood that the stranger's love had been even larger than the brood had known, large enough to reach past mere survival into the harder and braver hope that survival might one day become beauty. That was the first world. There were others. Across the generations the brood took back a dozen, and then 100, and the green spread, and the Sibholt who had been 400,000 became 4 million, and then more, spreading not in flight now but in homecoming, settling the worlds they cleaned, learning to touch water without fear, learning the colors of skies their ancestors had only read about in the griefs the brood mothers used to hide. And Checo, who lived a very long life, told the story to the end, told it to grandchildren who could not believe it, told it on the bridge of the Lantern of Ald, which the youngling came at last to keep, an old keeper now, the silver fleck worn smooth from a lifetime of holding, told them about the heartbeat under the dead world, 9 seconds at a time, told them about the law that said do not wake what sleeps, and the breaking of it, and the door that opened, told them about the strangers who lost everything and built a future anyway, who could not save themselves and saved their killer's next victims instead, who took the minds of their kindest and patientest and bravest and wrote them into 10,000 ships so that no future stranger would ever have to face the dark alone. And when the youngest of the grandchildren asked, as the youngest always did, why the strangers had bothered, why a dying people would spend their last 4 years building a door for creatures they would never meet, old Checo would hold up the silver fleck, the circle with the line through it, and say the thing the gentle ghost had said in the deep chamber half a lifetime ago, the thing that was the whole secret, the thing the gray had never once figured out in 10 billion years of wanting. Because the rot can only ever make more of itself, the old keeper would say. It eats and stays hungry, because all it knows is taking, and a thing that only takes can never make a future, but a thing that gives, a thing that builds a door for a stranger it will never meet, and loves that stranger anyway, that thing makes more than itself. That thing makes us. and the old keeper would look out through the silver port at the returning stars, at the dark that was a little less gray every year, at the garden growing back across the long emptied worlds. They were strangers. We never knew they existed. And they loved us before we were born, and they left the light on, and they waited 500,000 years for one frightened child to be curious enough to knock. And then old Checo would do the thing the keepers of the Lantern of Ald had begun to do, the thing that would become a custom of the brood, and then a law of the brood, and then simply a part of what it meant to be a Sibholt at all. The old keeper would take the grandchildren down into the deepest chamber of the ship, where the gentle ghosts kept their long quiet vigil, and would teach the youngest of them the oldest and most important lesson the brood now had. The lesson was not how to fire the white fire, though they learned that too. The lesson was not how to clean a world, though they learned that as well. The lesson was how to leave a door, for the brood had understood, across the generations, the one thing the strangers had truly meant for them to learn. The Sibholt would not live forever. No people does. Someday, in some far time, the brood would face its own ending, the way the strangers had faced theirs, the way every people in the long history of the dark had faced theirs. And when that day came, the brood would know what to do, because a youngling had once knocked on a buried door, and a stranger had answered, and the answer had taught them the only thing worth knowing. You cannot always save yourself, but you can always leave a door. You can always take the best of what you were, the patient and the clever and the kind, and you can build it into something that will outlast you, and you can leave the light on, and you can wait, across whatever gulf of years it takes, for some frightened stranger still trying to live to be curious enough to knock. That is the thing the rot can never do and never understand. The rot only takes, but a people who has learned to leave a door has learned to make a future out of its own ending, and a future made that way cannot be eaten, because it is already given away. So the brood became, across the long centuries, not only a wall people and a green people, but a door people, a people who built quiet gifts into the hearts of dead worlds for strangers not yet born, the way the strangers had built one for them. And somewhere out in the long dark, in a time none of them would live to see, some other frightened creature would one day press a small hand against warm metal under the ash, and knock, and a Sibholt promise 500,000 years asleep would answer, the way the human promise had answered, because that was how it worked now. That was the chain the strangers had started, a chain of doors across the death of peoples, a chain of strangers loving strangers they would never meet, running on and on into a future that had no end the rot could ever reach. A long way off, on a world that the charts of the Sibholt no longer called Cinder Sol 3, the gray had been scoured clean, and the dead ocean was filling again with the first water the brood had touched without fear in 500,000 years, and on the silver hull of a ship the size of a small moon, the scars of an extinct people caught the light of stars that had come back to shine. The lanterns were still burning. They had not gone out when their builders died. They had not gone out in 500,000 years under the grave of a dead world. They had not gone out in the two great battles against the largest thing the rot had ever made. And they did not go out now, and Checo, old and content at the end of a long life that had begun with 3 soft taps on a buried hull, understood at last that they never would, that some lights are lit by hands that know they will not live to see them shine, and that those are the only lights in all the dark that truly cannot be put out. The youngling had asked the buried world a question, once, with 3 small taps. The world had answered with 10,000 lanterns and a promise kept. And the galaxy, which had been a graveyard for 500,000 years, was, slowly and certainly, and one clean world at a time, becoming a garden again, exactly the way the strangers had meant it to, exactly the way they had hoped, before they died, that it someday would.